Okay, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CDS Lab RCN webinar series, and very happy to welcome our this week's speaker, Joyce Coffee, and Professor Qingwen Chang from ASU will introduce the speaker. Qingwen's yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. I'm Jingwen Chen, Assistant Professor of Landscape Architecture Design School at ASU, and I'm part of the team of CPS Lab Network. And today I have a pleasure to introduce our outstanding speaker, Joyce Coffey, who is the president and founder of Climate Resilience Consulting. And she's also a senior sustainability fellow at the Global Institute of Sustainability Innovation at ASU. So she's also my colleague. We actually know each other since she started working with our Urban Resilience to Extreme Sustainability Network project at ASU over 6 years ago. So Joyce has extensive experience, over 25 years of domestic and international experience with the corporate, government, and nonprofit sectors on how to implement the resilience and sustainability strategies, measurement systems, performance measurement, partnership, and benchmark and reporting. Her career started working with private sector projects in Southeast Asia for USAID, US-Asia Environmental Partnership in the World Bank. So she has very extensive experience, and today we are very honored to have her and to learn more about the infrastructure finance and how we deal with resilience. So I'll give the floor to Joyce. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Qingwen, and I am just absolutely honored to be a part of your community today. And it's so lovely to have benefited so much from your leadership for so many years in the Urban Resilience to Extremes, as you mentioned. So I'm going to share with all of you for about 30 minutes, and my presentation has 3 sections. I'm going to be talking a lot about some of the barriers to resilience finance and infrastructure finance, some of the solutions to those barriers, and then a few examples and cases of where infrastructure finance has really blossomed. But I really want to also start today with a reminder about what this means. The lack of infrastructure finance for resilience, of course, is something that all Americans are experiencing. And actually, it's true around the world, perhaps even more. But some Americans suffer more than others. And this is true in part because federal money means that wealth follows wealth. So even though you might think that your taxpayer dollars are actually helping to break the cycle of inequity, in resilience finance, we find that post-disaster, wealthier communities are better off and lower income and BIPOC communities are worse off. So I wanted to just remind us of that because we need to finance America's climate change future to change that fact, along with increasing money flows towards resilience projects. So hopefully today you're going to learn a little bit more about how you can increase funding and finance for resilience projects. And we're going to be examining some of the mechanisms that do this. Credit ratings, risk guidelines, and big data have really made some significant changes in this space, even since I started talking about this 4 years ago. And maybe we'll also have a chance to look at some of how different bond types work, because bonds are a big way that money flows into infrastructure projects, as many of you know. And if there's time at the end, I'll also share some gray lit resources that have been useful for me and that other practitioners have also called on. I know many of you are not in practice, and maybe when we get into the Q&A, you can share a little bit more about yourselves. I'd love to know who else is on the line today. But I think that the reason why I'm really involved in this question of resilience finance is that we all know that we need to move from planning for resilience to building it. And this is really a crucial moment because although there are many plans now for resilience than there didn't used to be, but now there are many more plans than there used to be. One key need of all those plans is more project finance, but there are absolutely gaps in the field about how we create resilience finance in the marketplace and how do we create projects that are bankable. And resilience is different from many other types of project finance, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I hope that by the end of our day, a very quick conversation today, you'll be a better bridge to various experts around how we can create more successful resilience projects through these mechanisms. And I did want to just make a quick shout out to the Urban Resilience to Extremes team and the work that I've been so fortunate to be involved with there because many of the ideas that I'm sharing with you today have come from my interaction with the 9 cities that have been a real important part of the Urban Resilience to Experience Strategic Research Network for the last several years. So I started by saying that I think we need to be aware that money currently post-disaster is flowing towards wealth. And in fact, that is a significant problem because we also see that climate risks are facing our poorest communities more than our more wealthy communities. So, the data that Science produced in 2017 showing that the poorest third of US counties are sustaining the greatest economic hardship from hurricanes, rising sea levels, and high temperatures had already played out here in Chicago. I'm calling in from Chicago today, where in 1995 we had an extraordinary heat wave that tragically took 730 lives, and those lives were almost 100% Black and Hispanic. And this just goes really in keeping with the very high cost of segregation in the United States, in Chicago and other big cities where we're losing lives. COVID puts a very fine point on that as well. And we are also losing huge economic opportunity by not fixing for the real systemic racism in the United States. And the bottom line from the perspective of climate risk and also the overlay that systemic racism causes to this climate risk is that we're all paying for these disasters and their impacts on our populations. And some states have really come in for a lot of our taxpayer dollars. So I don't see Arizona on this list. Well, that's great. But on the other hand, all Arizonans are part of the red here because you are contributing money to, and I know we're speaking with people all around the United States right now, but just to pick on Professor Cheng Wen, because I know that's where she is today. Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and California get a lot of tax dollars. So how can we see our way out of tax money for disaster recovery and into resilience finance? I mentioned I'm going to talk through a few things today, and let's start with just a very quick run through of some of the resilience barriers. Finance barriers. One is that, the official tools, primarily from FEMA, describe where we should expect to see flooding. But in fact, where we see flooding, this is a picture from Houston, and the diamonds show where the flooding actually occurred, and the shading shows where the FEMA flood maps are, is completely not correct. And this is actually extremely dangerous because we are continuing to flow money into projects that are in harm's way. Another is that a lot of leaders are really thinking about climate change as being a problem for the next generation, for some time down the road. But in fact, these risks are happening now. And this means that if you don't have climate change in your enterprise risk management, you are behind. And if you're thinking about climate risk that's happening 20 years from now, you are really investing in the wrong kinds of projects and products. And when I say you, I'm now speaking to the financial services industry, but also municipal government officials, private sector, anybody who is dealing in this quest for more stability and sustainability and security in our future. And the other, I think, really important thing to keep in mind is that for the longest time, climate resilience was understood to be about climate change, like greenhouse gas reductions, or even like recycling or plastics in the ocean, or more volunteerism. Climate resilience is, when it's dealt with by the sustainability team, it really loses a lot of its mojo because it's actually a huge risk and liability and operational question, and therefore can be quite distinct from the sustainability questions. And that kind of gets to the point that we are not measuring resilience very well, in part because we do not have an elegant measure of resilience the same way that we do, for instance, for greenhouse gas reductions or many of the other things that sustainability measures. So greenhouse gas reduction has the metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. But if you were to ask yourself today, like, what project in my community is building resilience? Okay, how am I going to measure that resilience was built in 5 years? Maybe one way you would measure it is, for instance, reduction in morbidity and mortality, like fewer people presented at the hospital because the city put in high albedo roofs. So there's more there's cooling happening in the evenings. Well, that's great, but then, so that's a very useful measure. But that high albedo roof is a totally different strategy than the bioswale to capture stormwater to decrease the amount of flooding that's occurring more as more rain is happening when we don't need it and less when we do. And so the risk measurement, I think, becomes a lot more complicated when you're talking about impact tools in the investment scene. And the other thing is that we seem to be, at least for a time, we were really lacking in parcel scale or project scale risk analytics. But I will say that the field here is growing exponentially, and hopefully many of you will make a big buck in your extraordinary intellectual capital applied to this question of how we can actually show at the scale of our home, our industrial property, our city, what the actual risks are today and in 5 years and 20 years down the road. And that these data are therefore much more easily integrated into the kinds of tools that financial services professionals use. Cost benefit analysis actually is less used by financial professionals than it is by engineering professionals and other planning type professionals. And then the data from the CBA, cost benefit analysis, is then translated into the pro forma for the financial services industry. But one of the major problems with that is that our cost benefit analysis tools, including from the federal government, are not useful in the climate change future. One, because they do not think about an appropriate timescale for avoided loss. And two, because they don't integrate the social and ecological benefits and disbenefits of the projects that we're putting forward. So we have a lot of work to do to embrace a new way of thinking about cost benefit and analytics. There have been, I think, including at the federal level, some good prospects here, including with the National Disaster Resilience Competition, now very much history, but they had I think a good tool for BCA. And I included here, even though it was historical, because it's one of the examples of the federal tool, which is typically the tool that a lot of, for instance, engineers would want to use, that was sanctioned and useful in the context of a more expansive cost benefit analysis. Another real reason why we have a barrier to more finance is that mostly when you think about, for instance, a private sector owner of an asset, that owner is not likely to want to do much beyond her fence line, just outside of the barriers of, where her physical asset is located. But climate risk reduction requires that we look at, what is the watershed, and what is the heat shed, and what is the wildfire shed, and do something about those things in order to decrease the risk to our particular asset. And then, of course, I don't think it's a surprise to all of us that we have over time been really growing in areas that are extremely risky. And when we think about a utopian place to retire or to live or to grow our business, we are doing so continually in places that are very, very risky. In fact, we're seeing even now that there is a correlation between the risk of climate change and home value. And what you probably are expecting me to say, if you're not watching my slides, is, well, yeah, if you have more risk, the home value should be lower. It's actually not the case. Very high risk properties are still some of the most high value properties in the marketplace as well. So we have some work to do there. And then finally, I mentioned this in my upfront, there's a real issue with bankability in that a lot of the projects that we need to put in place to protect our communities don't appear to be revenue generating. So this is not like installing a wind turbine or a solar panel in a solar field where you're going to be generating megawatt hours that you can sell in the marketplace. When you install a seawall or a sea barrier of some sort, it doesn't have a toll road on it. There's no way to actually create revenue from that, which is one of the reasons why our cost benefit analysis needs to be changed so that we can actually show the value in the marketplace of this barrier in terms of what it protects behind it. So what are some of the solutions? Just going to do a quick time check here, looking good. First of all, I want to be sure that before we get into some of the weeds on resilience finance, we remind ourselves of our practical nature. Resilience, if we do it well, can be something that doesn't have a ton of additional cost. If we integrate early into our projects what the adaptation needs are for our communities, we will see that we can carry out these projects smart and efficient and with less money. And if we mainstream our work around adaptation in the areas that our communities are demanding service, that is around health or nature, preservation and conservation, water management, these things come to mind for me because here I sit in Chicago and now we've realized that we have lead lines in our water pipes. So that is compounding then the question of how we pay for our stormwater and flooding. So we need to really be thinking carefully about our adaptation measures across all of the sort of top priorities that our communities face, because many communities will not say that their top priority is climate risk. So it's up to us to make the bridge between what their priorities and needs are and the climate resilience efforts. And then, of course, it's really great when we can, I mean, of course, now I'm showing my cards here, but it's great when we can regulate, because it essentially forces better decision-making by the private sector to ensure that the private sector is part of protecting our community. So what I mean by regulation here might be stormwater management, where you're having to manage a particular amount of metric ton of water on, cubic meter of water on your property, as one example. And there are some really important inspirations in the marketplace for resilience. One is that, we have more case and constitutional law showing that you can be sued if you have not done your job around mitigating risk including from extreme weather events. And so force majeure or an act of God is no longer a fair claim. So this is important for the financial services industry. It's important for real estate. It's important for engineering. It's important for urban planning. All of those professions are really on the hook. A second area where we're seeing more and more drive to really increase understanding about risk and risk tolerance is in the credit rating agencies, which is, we know what many corporates live and die by, and many urban and county and utility and state financial services leaders live and die by. And the credit rating agencies, and Moody's in particular, have now said, do you have a climate risk mitigation plan or climate adaptation plan as part of your the planning structure in your let's say your corporate or your urban leadership? Or do you have a leader who's responsible for that, the management of that? Are you considering what the economic disbenefits are of not getting your act together around climate? So we'll get into that a little bit more. The insurance industry is also in some areas increasing the cost of insurance. Of course, we know that the National Flood Insurance Program at the federal level is potentially going to change. It's been supposed to be changed for many years, and it sort of can just keep being kicked down the road. But in the case of insurance increasing costs, we have to think about means testing so that we are not pricing lower income people out of their homes in a way that is unfair. And then finally, I mentioned earlier the point about big data and parcel scale data. It turns out there is more and more of those data. So the market is really inspired to do more with the data that exists. Now, in the middle of that slide were a picture of two white guys, Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg. Mark Carney is the former head of the Bank of England and the head of the Financial Stability Board. And of course, Michael Bloomberg, a scion in the investment space and the former mayor of New York, along with the UN climate ambassador and other things. They created this task force on climate-related financial disclosure. And if you're interested in anything that I'm talking about in my remarks today, I recommend that you go to the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure site, and look into it a little bit more. But essentially, now we have actually thousands of financial institutions who are following the guidelines from TCFD. And these guidelines say that you need to be looking at your transition risks. That is the risk of the economy changing to move away from fossil fuel energy. And also you need to look at your portfolio from the perspective of physical risks, both the acute risks like hurricanes and tropical cyclones, and also the chronic risks, that is drought and changes in growing cycles and that kind of thing. So it's a really, really important driver to a lot of the things that I'm talking about in this speech. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You're welcome to take a picture of it, I guess the slides may be available after the presentation today. But just to keep in mind that a lot of people wonder, well, how are the credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's looking at climate risk? Because first of all, it is a little bit of a black box. There are private entities, of course, they're federally regulated, and they do have their own algorithms for how they calculate the credit rating. But they have been very open about how they are thinking about climate risk. And I think, of course, COVID is another thing that's really impacting the balance sheets for many corporate and municipal government leaders, for instance. So I put that on here too, because it often comes up like, well, if they're looking at climate risk, how are they now dealing with another new risk, the COVID risk? So these are not my words. This comes from many webinars that Standard & Poor's particularly has put out about how they're thinking about integrating these risks into the ratings. I mentioned bankability earlier. You know, we think that a seawall or sea barrier may not be bankable, but I think one of the things that we know is that there are different sources of money, and investors are really good at plumbing each of these pools of money for resilience investment, and actually more for traditional investments. So thinking about how we might be able to increase these revenue streams towards resilience is a huge solution set. And I'll get into this a little bit more when I talk about bonds as I come to that section of my presentation in a minute or two. And the other thing is that I think we really need to, and we owe it to ourselves to look at new urban utopias. And I'm thinking about Phoenix and Tempe a little bit just because, you know, ASU is our host today. And, you know, acknowledging that some of us might have thought, well, that's not actually a new urban utopia. Like, they have so much extreme heat and there's a real question about water. And water availability. But the bottom line is that many cities, Phoenix and Tempe included, Phoenix in particular, have done a really great job of showing themselves to be resilient and managing these extremes that we are facing today and will continue to face and will grow over time, so that they in fact could be receiving communities for those along the coasts or along river's edge or in the wildfire urban interface that are going to have to move. I mean, the migration and managed retreat are absolutely at the top of the list for how we build resilience, which I know is not part of this conversation today, but it's something we need to be paying for. And one way to think about that is, because what, you know, the investment sector wants is where they're going to make money. Well, maybe we can help them think about where the new urban utopias are and help them to invest in those places so that there are safe, secure, stable communities for the retreating homeowners who have left a lot behind and are feeling pretty exhausted and you know, want a lovely place to call home. And we also need to move from planning and giving awards and doing you know, a lot of really wonderful, innovative thinking into actually putting the spade in the ground. And I think all of these, you know, Rebuild by Design, the National Disaster Resilience Competition, Boston and New York City's work, they have shown, of course the Bay Area too, that it is possible to move from these really big concepts into actual resilience building, but not a moment too soon, sorry. You know, we can't have a conversation about resilience finance without pointing out the real value of public-private partnerships. And even though the United States is not as forward-thinking about public-private partnerships as other nations, we do have a robust PPP sector here, in part driven by engineering firms that are quite good at understanding how utilities work that are owned by the public sector, and how the private sector can add value through efficiencies within the infrastructure sector. So, you know, never hesitate to really question where could we share risk and also reward in a project, because I think you can find that, you know, the PPP system does in fact do a few things. One, it can really increase the time in which projects are completed, because there's a lot of efficiencies. Of course, it could also drag things out, but in the best case scenario, it can increase the time, and it can increase the money that flows into a capital stack for a project, because, you know, we're talking about private money now coming in. Of course, we don't necessarily want all of our public services to be privatized. I'm not suggesting that, but there are places where it's been shown to be very effective. And as I'm near the end here about the solutions, I just want to remind us that there are lots of ways to really see great benefit from our resilience project. And the data here are probably not new to you. They come from the Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council's interim report in January of 2019. This is part of the National Institute of Building Sciences, which is a quasi-federal institute. And they essentially give us some stuff that I think is pretty amazing. Meeting code pays back $11 for every dollar that's invested in the code compliance. That is, the project building to code compliance pays back 11 bucks. I mean, gosh, that's a really good return. That's even better than the stock market has been in the last you know, year. And federally funded projects, that is through federal grants that are focused on riverine flooding, risk mitigation, they're paying back taxpayers $6 for every buck that is invested in those grants. So there is proof in the pudding that avoided loss, this is risk mitigation here, has a lot of return. And from a totally different perspective, but not the federal perspective that NIBS took, the Urban Land Institute also has given us the gift of several cases that show that there is a real market return in the real estate sector for building resilience. So often I get asked in presentations like, well, can we do a McKinsey cost curve for resilience the same way we can for greenhouse gas reduction? And if you're not familiar with the McKinsey cost curve for greenhouse gas reduction, it essentially put everything from energy efficiency to nuclear power to utility scale solar on a grid, and they said, how much greenhouse gas emissions do we get per dollar invested for each one of these tactics? And the bottom line is that can be a solution for resilience finance, but unlike greenhouse gas reduction, where I talked about earlier, there's this pretty unique measure that goes across all projects. Resilience is extremely specific to its sector and its geography. So the cost curve is generally for one project. You're going to look at one project and say, well, if we did it this way, how much would we save? If we did it this way, how much would we save? So levees and flood walls versus elevating properties. Where is our cost benefit in each one of those? Yes, you can do a cost curve, but not across the entire United States. Another solution is to stress test. This would be in the case where you have someone who's very hesitant around climate. That word is, they're allergic to that word. You could talk to them about thinking about what is the 1% chance event, that 1 in 100-year event. Imagine that happening more frequently. How should we create more finance flows to prevent that risk from causing more damage? Because that risk will happen more frequently now. It's not a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 200-year event. It's a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 20-year event. So thinking about ways to get around the whole question of climate change, I think, is really important. It's still in some of our leadership circles. And of course, looking for money well outside of the typical places. So you're not going to find money, and this is just for the city of New York, but you could be taking a corporate entity, you could be taking a campus, you could be taking certainly another type of government, a utility, and asking where the money is going to flow in order to see multiple benefits, collateral benefits. So when I talked about earlier, bankability, maybe the New York City Water Board does need to do more to improve water quality by replacing pipes so that there's less lead, which, by the way, is a fictitious case. I do not know if that's the case. Well, in the meantime, maybe as long as they're digging up the streets, they should be putting in higher albedo streets to deal with urban heat islands. So in that case, they should also be working with the transit, the New York Transportation Department. So just thinking about collateral benefits in a very pragmatic way can be a real, I think, benefit to many of our communities, and in terms of especially increasing finance flows. And finally, just to remind us that we are talking here about increasing resilience so that we can break the cycle of poverty and increase social equity and racial equity. I think it's really important for us to remember that when we are thinking about where we identify project funding and where we flow funding to, we need to be solving first for communities that have currently faced and will face in the future greater vulnerability and exposure to these existing hazards. And this is called targeted universalism, and it's pretty easy to do. You can do it the wrong way too. You can take a map that says, oh, look, the water and basement and the poverty maps are exactly the same. Okay, well, let's not do anything with water and basement in those areas. That's called redlining, and it's illegal, and it still happens. Or you can take the water and basement map and the poverty map and say, oh my gosh, we are going to increase pipe size tomorrow in these communities that are suffering from so many other things, including the lack of modernization of our infrastructure, and therefore hopefully solve for some of their flooding problems. So there's a lot that we can do to increase equity in all of the work that we do for resilience, and I'm going to get into some of these examples in the latter part of my presentation. But since I'm running a little short on time, I'm not going to walk through these right now. You can take a picture if you want, and the same goes for some examples of building social equity into the project pipelines that we have. I will give you a few examples of those moving forward now. So let's talk a little bit about investment types. And I'm going to go quickly over the overview of these because either A, you know about them already, or B, you'll learn a little bit more in the example. So I'm going to give about 5 different types of investment, and for each one, I'll give a brief example of how it's used. So for instance, the general obligation bond, which we know is funded through our taxes, One great example of a general obligation bond is the Miami Forever bond, which passed, by the way, in a city where the mayor was elected on a no new taxes platform, and where the mayor at the time was a climate denying mayor. They passed the Miami Forever bond, which essentially floods $400 million into both stormwater management and affordable housing. So it's a really phenomenal example of, first of all, working from the grassroots. So the mayor was able essentially to let the grassroots strum up interest in this new tax. And when it was put on to ballot, it was approved without the mayor having to say, oh, now I believe in having taxes and I believe in climate risk. And second of all, this collision between these two social ills has allowed for a lot of, and will over time more and more, a lot of co-solving, because as the map shows here, those red dots are both areas of great affordable housing need and also those that face a lot of flooding risk. Another very frequently used type of investment that either A, we have in our own portfolios if we're investors, or B, we are benefiting from because we're constituents. So the university we work for has a revenue bond, or the city we live in has many revenue bonds. In the revenue bond space, keep in mind that there are now actually whole typologies in the revenue bond space that increase the approach and make more rigorous the approach to resilience finance. So the Climate Bonds Initiative is the only group in the world that actually certifies green bonds. But of course, you can have a green bond that's not certified. Even still, you should definitely have a look at their climate resilience principles, because they really help to spell out hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, for instance, from the investment perspective, from the financial services industry's perspective. How do they think about those things? And how would my project therefore benefit if I started talking in those terms? Because I'm thinking about those things too, but maybe more from an academic perspective or more from a planning perspective. And of course, the other thing that these resilience principles do is point out the need for co-benefits in any of the green project. Then the thing I haven't mentioned here, but I think is really, really huge, especially when we're now talking about more international finance, is that we avoid maladaptation. There's a lot of ways, including when we think we're building a resilience project, that we can be creating more harm. And I think the most classic one of those that we are aware of is for instance, where you might have a place that has mostly dirt roads. I'm now talking about a lower income country. And in order to get to market, the populace generally has been very slow because they're having to go on dirt roads. So you put in a paved road between a rural area and a market center. But what that paved road does is then it encourages people to start living on the hillsides that are near the paved road. And lo and behold, you actually cause a morbidity and mortality in the next rain event because people are taken through extreme flooding. So there's a lot of ways to think about maladaptation in every project that we do, and we must be asking questions like that. Here's another, I think, really interesting new revenue bond structure, and it has a couple of, I think, real benefits in it. One is a favorite thing, a tool of mine is stormwater fees. And I think we need to be really careful that we are thinking about our water rates, which is the water that we get from our tap when we turn it on, separate from our sewer rates, which is the amount of water we pay to have the water that comes from our toilet, our showers, and our sinks treated. Those are two separate things, and they have generally been funded through the same bill that you receive every month. But when they are separated, it allows us to do things like what Miami did. They separated the stormwater fee from the water fee, and then they raised that fee over the course of about 3 different years, which did not require a vote from their people. It required their commissioners, their council members, to say yes to do that. And then combining that with some TIF funds, they created essentially a $600 million pot of money. Of course, some of that money came in from the private sector, but they were able to leverage the revenue from the stormwater fee, sewer fee, to woo that money in to start elevating roadways and creating sea barriers on public property and doing other really, I think, crucial parts of their overall attempt to create out of their archipelago a future for all those high net worth individuals that are building there. Another investment type, and I know I'm running short on time here, so I'll go quickly, is an environmental impact bond. And this is where you have investors who are not necessarily looking for the same rate of return they might get from a general obligation bond or a revenue bond. They're willing to take a little bit of a hit on the amount of money they earn on the principal of their investment in order to be able to claim that, yes, I served my community, or I served the nation, because maybe sometimes they don't even know the communities they're investing in, because this bond that I am putting money into has decreased stormwater. And by a certain number of cubic meters flowing into the sewer system, for instance. The District of Columbia has done a really great job with that kind of environmental impact bond. We see them also, though, in the transportation sector. Here, the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, in renovating Government Center, worked in a huge amount of stormwater management, along with, by the way, money for other abled individuals to be able to get access to Government Center. So it was a real project for collateral benefits. And one reason why this case is the most important, perhaps, of the stories that I'm telling, is that the same day that they launched an environmental impact bond, essentially, for the MBTA to do this work, they also launched a bond that they did not call sustainable. It was just a regular bond. And the bond that they launched that was called sustainable actually had it was oversubscribed. More investors wanted to pay money to invest in that project than they did in the routine project. So that's, I think, a really important part of our next steps. So catastrophe bonds are the kind of bond you really don't ever want to be able to claim in terms of if you are the owner of the asset, but it's a great tool if you are an investor, because essentially you get paid out, your money comes back to you unless there is a catastrophe that ruins the investment that you are putting money into. So in the case that there is a catastrophe, then if you've made an investment, let's say you're putting money into the MTA, a Metro Transit Authority in New York, their catastrophe bond, if they get flooded like they did in Sandy, then you lose all your money. So it's an all or nothing thing, but it's I think a really crucial part of where all of us are going. The last set of cases I want to share with you have to do with stormwater retention credits, because this is a little bit more of a market sector that isn't around bonds, and I did spend a lot of time on the bond piece. So, and again, DC is a great example here. If you are a developer in downtown DC, you have to do one of two things. Either A, figure out how to absorb all of the stormwater that is hitting the property that you are building. That is the surface parking, the roof, and even sheeting off of the side of the building if it's a taller building. Either you have to absorb that water on site, which is very unlikely given how the cost of property in downtown DC, or you can pay into a credit system, the stormwater retention credit system, that then allows for new sponge function to be built in the watershed. And in this case, one of the reasons I really love this is that where the sponge function is being built is very specific and intentional. It's being built in Anacostia, which is a BIPOC lower income community just outside of the District of Columbia, or just outside of downtown, that faces a huge amount of flooding and where there's a lot of opportunity for solutions. So I'm always really keen on that. And I want to end with just reminding us that, there are lots of ways to make an extremely affordable resilience just by making sure that every project that we put in the ground, we are putting our money towards resilience. So cut the curb, in this case, in Tucson, as long as you're going to install one, so that there is, a way for the water to escape from the hardscape into the softscape. I don't have time to go through the various practitioner resources, but maybe we'll talk about some of those in the Q&A. And I'll take myself off of the video now and hopefully have some great questions and suggestions and critiques from all of you.
Yes, we do. We have a few questions. Thank you very much Joyce, for this presentation. Professor Qingwen wants to start the discussion.
Hi, thank you, Joyce. That's a fantastic presentation with a lot of information. And my first question, actually thinking about a recent event happened in Texas.
Yeah.
And all these cascading disasters happened, and it seems we can trace back to the private market mechanism, right? Doing the infrastructure systems, but they don't have incentives to, be motivated to invest more, because they will lose their competitivity, right, with other companies. So then how can we incentivize the private sectors to do more, to invest in this future risk that they don't, because they are not the one who is going to suffer or to bear the cost in the long run. So how would you incentivize that?
Well, I mean, the way that we think about private sector, right, there are two ways to get the private sector to do something. One is you incentivize them by giving them a little bit of money to do something or giving them more market share or something. The other is that you require them to do something. So there's the carrot and the stick. And I really think that in the case, like Texas is a good example, but it could be anywhere, that we need to change our typically local land use law, local stormwater law, local air quality laws, to require more of our private sector because as we begin to do that, the private sector likes to stay ahead of regulation. They would much rather do it their own way rather than be regulated, because regulation actually takes a little more money. You have to follow the rules and file the paperwork and versus like, oh, you know what, we're going to do more around albedo on our property because we hear that the city is getting ready to put together a new law around albedo. I think the case of Texas is a really interesting one because you pointed out cascading failures. I mean, ultimately, my understanding is that one of the things that failed was public. Electric utility grid failed. And so part of what I think is really interesting here, and interesting in a very sad way, is what does the state's role in regulating the electric utility to ensure that there is belt and suspenders? And maybe that belt and suspenders isn't just around the infrastructure itself, the power lines. Maybe the belt and suspenders is that they work with resilience hubs in neighborhoods so that there is always a stock of water and a place to charge your phone and a place to warm up, right? I mean, that is a very grassroots thing, but that would have saved so many people a lot of problems. I mean, I say hair tearing, but people lost their jobs, people became ill. Like, the more grassroots that you can find these solutions, even if the problem is actually ultimately at the scale of utility, the more our communities are going to thrive. So I think another answer to your question is that we need to be demanding more of the big money utilities, including not only that they serve the engineering function that is clearly a part of their role, but that they also serve a social function because they are responsible for service delivery. And when service delivery fails, we see disasters like Texas. I should also mention, I mentioned that book Cooked. It was at the very beginning of my presentation, and the tragedy of urban heat in Chicago. That was caused by Commonwealth Edison having a power failure. So, and we know, of course, the wildfires in California. Electric utility, I mean, we need to love those guys until they change themselves in some way. They are at the source of a lot of problems. So great question.
Thank you. We have another question from David Baxter, who was our speaker maybe a month ago. Hi, David.
Hi there, and Joyce, enjoyed your presentation. I just wanted to add one little thing about the Texas debacle. What was interesting is ERCOT knew that the event was going to happen. They had all the technology in place. They had all the warnings. They had everything in place. And I think that's one of the cases of where technology and smart innovation is only strong as the weakest human link.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that, we also need to, you can put the best measures in place. You can do every sort of planning under the sun, but if the will is not there, the decisions aren't there, the commitment isn't there, then we fail. But that wasn't my question. I just couldn't resist commenting on that. The question that I have, I've talked to a number of reinsurance in giant companies globally. And, one of the things they talk about constantly is, insurance risk. Do you have any ideas on how insurance risk could impact resilience investment, or maybe how does resilient investment turn it around, impact insurance risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, two things. First of all, David, your background is phenomenal. And second of all, I really appreciate all of your writing. So I know you all heard from him last time, it sounds like, but be sure you read the work that David leads. It's fascinating. So on the insurance side, a few things here. One, there is a group called the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, CCRI, and it was started by Willis Towers Watson, and it is now a force to be reckoned with. trying to figure out, not just from the insurance perspective, although that's a huge part of it, how the financial service industry can be more focused on resilience. Because the TCFD, I mentioned the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure, one thing that really worries me about it is that essentially it says, move away from your risk. If you are a Wall Street investor and you can, take the shell of your money and move the shells all over the game board, take your money out of risky places. Well, that is super tough on our communities. So, if the insurance sector, on the other hand, says, oh, you know what, double down on resilience investments, that is, I think, a really important counterpoint to the TCFD guidance. So what we know about where the insurance industry is today is, number one, they do understand that increasing rates is a huge market message. It says you're in a risky place and do something about it. And we see, of course, in the case of California, they required that fire insurers stick with the properties they were already insuring. But soon after the year of that requirement is gone, insurers are going to require that you prove that you have fire mitigation all over your property. So that's a real forcing function in the market, which is obvious, but I think it needs to be said. Because in other times, the insurance industry has not done that as much. They've simply had the large, Class A insurers move away from the risk, like in Florida, after the 1992 Hurricane Andrew, which really decimated a lot of the insurance industry. Many big insurers didn't go back for a long time, but there was still insurance to be had on the market. And so properties were still built in risky areas. So this is a somewhat new pivot. And then the second thing I would say is that there are a lot of insurance-linked securities. I mentioned catastrophe bonds. I was very swift with going through those. There are also new mechanisms which haven't yet actually been tested in the marketplace, but they are theoretically very interesting, including what's called by some a resilience bond. And I'm saying by some because the term resilience bond is used in the marketplace in a whole variety of different ways. So don't get confused if you're going to read about it and you find someone describing it differently. But one way it's described is that you would have, for instance, the Hyatt that's owned by private, the World Trade Center that's owned by city, and the military naval base that's owned by the Department of Defense. All three of them have insurance. They work with Goldman Sachs to pool the amount they pay into their insurance premiums every month. And then Goldman Sachs takes that insurance premium that they're getting from these three different owners, and they use it to create a bond. And that bond builds a seawall. Now, and the reason why Goldman Sachs would be involved in this way is because although the seawall is not creating any money, the savings on the insurance premiums is creating money for Goldman Sachs. So Hyatt and World Trade Center and DoD are still paying the same amount, but they're having fewer floods. So that kind of insurance-linked security is on its face, I think, a really important new era for the insurance sector. No insurance company has got involved in any of those kind of products yet. In the United States, we have something that's I think really important around that, which is municipal bonds are tax-free. And so the insurance sector has even more reason to want to be involved in these kind of deals because it gets them involved in a product that could potentially bring them just a little margin more of investment. The last item I'm going to mention is on the other side of the balance sheet for insurance companies. So insurance companies, we own insurance for our homes, our cars, whatever. We also know that the insurance industry has trillions of dollars of assets under management. So they're a huge player in the marketplace. And just like BlackRock, we hear a lot about, oh, well, they're going to now divest from fossil fuels. They have a big adaptation and resilience platform. The insurance industry is more quietly working to ensure that their investments are going towards longer term resilience. So that's a third very separate thing. But can I ask, and I know we're running a little short on time, David, you're very smart about all of these things, and in particular probably know a lot in answer to your own question. Do you have any other suggestions you want to share with the group?
Well, I just have a concern, and that is based, on certain insurance policies, if you want to call it, have almost encouraged bad behavior in the past. I mean, you just have to think of FEMA flood insurance, for example. It pays people, well, how would you call it, rewards bad behavior for people building homes in floodplains. And year after year, it's just ludicrous. But I think what's happening is there's definitely a trend towards risk management and requiring insurance companies requiring that as part of their, how would you call it, assessment of the risk, they will ask questions along the lines, do you have a risk management plan? Do you have resilience built into your infrastructure or into your project? And if they don't, they're going to say, well, your choice is, pay a higher premium or, come up with it, and then we will give you a discount. And I think one thing that would be really interesting would be over time, for example, if you drive a car and you don't have accidents because you are a careful driver and you're a responsible driver, a lot of insurance companies would give you a refund or drop your premiums. This should be something that I think in a very simplistic way underlines, this resilience sort of insurance as well, that if your facility survives multiple adverse weather events like hurricanes or flooding or whatever, then the incentive is to lower the investment premium. So I mean the what you call it, insurance premium. So just some thoughts that I've been mulling around.
Great, thank you so much. I just put an article in the chat if anyone wants to look at it. USA Today, very easy to read. TIF, by the way, in Arizona, I think you're right. I don't think TIF is a source of funding for Arizona, but there's lots of other options there. And tax increment financing does work in a lot of other communities. And TIF for resilience projects can be, I think, a way that cities who don't want to do anything unique and fancy could do a lot more to invest in resilience. And for those who are not unfamiliar, tax increment financing essentially takes tax benefits or takes taxes from, for instance, an industrial corridor and reinvests those tax revenues in projects in other parts of the city or in that same community that have a social benefit. So wouldn't it be great if that TIF money were also going towards resilience projects? Other questions?
Yes, actually, thank you. We have 3 more questions. Let's see if we can take a look.
I don't know about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. I'm sorry. I don't deal in energy, in the energy sector. I deal in climate resilience. So I don't work on greenhouse gas reduction. So I haven't been keeping tabs on it. I am keeping tabs on the Storm Act and the new money coming in for the Building Resilient Infrastructure for Communities, BRIC, which is a FEMA program. I think both of those have a lot of potential for our communities in terms of more money from the federal government, which of course we do need more money on the pre-recovery side. We're just pouring money into disaster recovery, as of course we need to because people suffer, but a lot of those funds would be much better served per the cost benefit analysis I showed if we put them in the pre-recovery. So tell your senators.
We have a question from Jesus Pedraza. Jesus?
Hello, thank you
Hi.
everybody for having me today. I just want to let you know that I love the information that you're sharing with us today. It's definitely great and a good tool to be using for me right now because I'm in the process of business planning.
Oh, good.
So my main focus is to help clean the environment. I really feel like something needs to be done. I'm passionate about it, but at the same time, I'm just getting out of the Army. I'll be getting out in about 5 months.
Thank you.
And really, I'm just trying to see if there's a source that I would be able to use to help locate these bonds, to be able to, fund our business effectively and be able to get what we're trying to do. Because what I've come to realize that even though it's a little bit more expensive going the green route, it's the long term that I'm really pushing for. So I really want a good base. That's what I'm really pushing for. So if there's a source that you would be able to recommend or any kind of services.
Well, let me just say that I think it's sort of like a 3 steps that I would recommend. Yeah, maybe there are some sources out there, but first, a bond might not be the best way to fund a startup or a particular corporate need. You might find that simply taking on debt from your bank is slightly easier. Bond projects generally are for $20 million and above. And that is for or like a municipal bond. Corporate bonds, I actually don't know as much about them, but in any case, multi-million dollars. And the reason for that is that they have a high transaction cost You know, they bring in a lot of players. You have to have an intermediary, and there's all sorts of people who have to review the features, versus like going to your bank and saying, okay, I need to take on some debt here in order to, you know, fund the assets for my company. Now, you may be talking about multi-million-dollar investment, in which case, I think there's the way that you would tend to do it is you would go to one of the major investment houses and find their bond advisor group, and you would ask to have a conversation with one of them. That would be, I think, a really significant recommendation. Yeah. And also, by the way, I have benefited in my own company from, I don't know how big your firm is, so this may not, it may be much bigger than what I'm thinking, but you know, there are business development centers that a lot of cities run, especially for minority and women-owned businesses, and they can provide you with, I think, some really good ways to access lower cost capital. For instance, finding investors who are looking for veterans who are, you know, trying to do something. And there are specific investors that want to invest in that kind of thing. And these minority and women-owned business incubators essentially can help you be put in touch with them. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Joyce. And should we go through the last question with Roberto Rojas, and then we can finish? Thank you.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting, a very, very new topic. So I was wondering, how can we use this kind of bond strategy and reliability for climate justice?
Yeah.
Make it sense.
Well, I think the first thing is that, you know, your question in the chat struck me that we're talking now about the municipal government. And one thing that we need to be sure is that municipal government is spending money in lower income communities, because municipal government is spending a lot of money. You could go right now to wherever you live and on the city website, look for the capital improvement plan, CIP, or the capital improvement budget, and you would see millions, maybe billions of dollars that are allocated for various projects. Those projects, they get to choose what part of the city the project is being carried out in. And so, you know, in the case of Chicago, I'll just say, a lot of that relates to how much of a problem an alderman is making, you know, how much squeak he's making, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so if you have a community that you know needs resources and has not gotten it in the past, that is something that right now in this current era is unacceptable. It didn't used to be unacceptable, but George Floyd's death changed how cities are perceived. City governance, city policing, city infrastructure. So it's a great time to say, I have a less affluential community here that I have not seen you do any work in around, for instance, well, I don't know what you were talking about here, but let's just say, you know, replacing pipes or improving the, you know, getting rid of the potholes in the streets, and being able to say to them, you should be allocating money there. So I think that the bottom line answer to your question is, it's not that those places are uninsurable or that we can't get a project going in those places. It's that the market has generally avoided, because they you know, they want to be sure that their returns are strong or whatever. They've generally avoided these neighborhoods, and that's no longer acceptable from the perspective of brand and champion. It gets somewhat back to David's point. Like, it's pretty easy for Texas to have the stuff on the books and then completely ignore it. So holding the leadership accountable, I think, is really key. Anyway, I'm sorry we didn't have time for all the incredible insights from the rest of the group, but it's really been a pleasure to be a part of this community. And I thank Ching-Wen and Cecilia and Nuri so much for having the opportunity. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao.